Well, good day, everyone, and welcome to Paris Education Governance webinar titled Back to School, Challenges to Teaching While Managing a Pandemic. We are joined by colleagues who will share based on their experiences, expertise, on possible priorities and new capacities necessary to facilitate accessible continued learning and teaching within the context of the COVID-19. My full name is Nomangcocho Phakade. I'm a researcher for the Public Affairs Research Institute. I'm also the co-lead in the program Education Governance, and I'll be presenting briefly on the working paper, the background, and then I'll be joined by my colleague, Dr. Towozani Chilenga Butau, who will present the findings. Each of the panelists will present for about 15 minutes. We're hoping to have an engagement right at the end through the Q&A session. And the presentations will begin with Dr. Faranaaz Veriava, who heads the Education Rights Program at the Public Interest Organization, Section 27. Faranaaz is also a part-time lecturer within the Faculty of Law at the University of Pretoria. Dr. Veriava has also worked at IDASA, the South African Human Rights Commission, and the Center for Applied Legal Studies. And Dr. Veriava will be followed by Ms. Xolisa Guzula, a lecturer in language and literacy studies with a focus on multilingual and multiliteracies education at the University of Cape Town. Xolisa also has experience in early literacy and biliteracy teacher training and community literacy. She is one of the founders of a network of community literacy clubs emerging across the country and is a doctoral student researching third spaces as a way towards transforming language and literacy pedagogies and a member of Boa Lit Language and Literacy Collective. Welcome, sis. We are also joined by the General Secretary of the South African Democratic Teachers Union, SADTU, Mr. Maluleke Mugwena, who is also a PhD candidate in Business Administration Program. Mr. Mugwena has been the SG since 2009, has also been the Vice President of the Education International for Africa region since 2015, currently also a Deputy Chairperson of Quality Education Campaign since 2018. We are also in the company of Professor Martin Gustafsson, a senior researcher at the Research on Social Economic Policy Unit, which is linked to the Department of Economics at Stellenbosch University. He works extensively for the Department of Basic Education and has done work for the UNESCO Institute for Statistics. And those will be the four discussants, if you like, who will be engaging us in our working paper. Thank you all for making time. And I also welcome to our attendees, and thank you also for joining us. We'd like to encourage the attendees to please send in comments and questions through the Q&A icon. That will be also leading us in terms of other questions for our last session. And so much of the dialogue will center on the working paper, which itself is titled Exploring Institutional Coordination of the Return to Schools, Provincial Education Responses to COVID-19. And so when we conceptualized this particular research work, we looked at the purpose, and that was to examine factors that led to the reopening of schools, specifically in the Eastern Cape and the Western Cape during the pandemic, with a specific focus, again, on the provincial education departments. And so we gathered data between August and September in 2020, using semi-structured interviews that we framed following through the three phases. The first one being pre-closure and approach to learning, the second being preparedness to reopening, and the last one, implementation of the recovery plans in the public schooling sector. And so we engaged in conversation with different education officials and education stakeholders. And so the COVID-19 pandemic globally imposed a rapid shift to online teaching and learning through different modalities. Sweden and Taiwan counted amongst the very few countries that continued schooling in 2020. In Africa, governments announced the gradual reopening of schools from June. For example, the 1st of June in Nigeria and Zambia, the 8th of June in South Africa, and the 22nd of June in Liberia and Tanzania, in particular prioritizing the exit grades 7 and 12. And this is according to the World Bank 2020 report. But by September 2020, the United Nations Children Fund, UNICEF, reported that only 13 out of the 21 countries in Eastern and Southern Africa had reopened schools. In South Africa, as we enter the second academic year constrained by the pandemic, now in its second wave, we are confronted with a decade of digital learning along with its related inequalities and the task to reshuffle learning and recovery plans over the years. The National Department of Education, the private sector, and NGOs have made interventions in education ICTs over the past few years, which all have been disrupted one way or the other during the pandemic. However, it must be noted that the 2019 DBE self-diagnosis report recognizes that there's a lack of support for teachers in the integration of technology into the curriculum. We're also experiencing incomplete technology infrastructure and high bandwidth costs, amongst other constraints. Nonetheless, a day before the national lockdown on the 17th of March in 2020, the DBE submitted to the Parliamentary Portfolio Committee a phased-in approach of the ICT rollout plans, with the implementation phase scheduled for the financial year 2019 to 2020, and its phase 3 in 2024. Colleagues, comrades and allies, this is the context of ICT in education. As such, there are three moving parts that are being developed. A, being the technology policy and strategy implementation. B, technology infrastructure and digital literacy, technical support if you like. And C, technology operations that include updated systems and timeous processes. On the other hand, there are pre-existing conditions of uneven capacities across provinces that are as a consequence of the historical governance legacies within the basic education system. For instance, the phased-in reopening of schools scheduled for the 1st of June in 2020 depended on the extent of readiness of schools concerning compliance with, for example, health, safety, and social distancing protocols, including the provincial submissions of the recovery plans. Yet 2 days prior to the reopening of schools on the 30th of May in 2020, the Council of Education Ministers received 3 submissions, one on the state of school readiness produced by the NECT, the second, the state of delivery of water tanks and supply of water by Rand Water. The third, as the state of readiness for the phased-in reopening of schools by the HEDCOM. Based on these findings, the Council of Education Ministers was of the view that the education system required more time to even out the different levels of readiness across the provinces. Again, in August 2020, in the reopening of schools, only Gauteng and Western Cape were categorized as ready to open, with Limpopo, KwaZulu-Natal, and Mpumalanga as the least ready, according to the Department of Education. This unevenness is evident in the varying levels within the administrative and processes towards the state of readiness, both in 2020 and also in 2021 in the reported delays due to the second wave. And so in the working paper, we explore the notion of institutional coordination as a prism in understanding provincial education responses to the pandemic, through which we argue that the pandemic has produced an opportunity for some change in the capacity of provincial education departments and teaching policies in South Africa. Within the identified common priorities on prevention and management of infections while promoting continued learning through hybrid learning approaches, the provincial education departments adopted a range of approaches and practices to address these priorities. However, mitigating learning losses warrants a closer investigation into the delays in the reopening of schools, further questioning temporary interventions that, for example, do not significantly deal with the infrastructure backlog. You can look into technology, electricity, or water in any of our provinces. Simultaneously, the implementation of the recovery plans ought to be mindful of those easily excluded and marginalized within our classed quintile schooling system. I will end there with a broad reminder of the context where we were in 2020, and I would like now to invite my colleague to share the findings of the working paper. Dr. Thokozani Chilenga Butao, as I've said earlier on, is a co-lead of the Education Governance Program at PARI, and also a lecturer in political studies at Wits University. Over to you, Togo.
Thank you, Noma, and thank you everyone for attending. I will now share the findings of our working paper. As Noma said, our education system has a lot of inequalities, and some of these inequalities are influenced by the historical legacies of apartheid education, Bantu education, and the unevenness that spread through the education system and what is now known as provincial education departments. Therefore, we are interested in exploring institutional coordination in two departments that are known for having these inequalities and issues of accessibility to education, given the rural and urban divide, as well as differences in learner outcomes in two different contexts. We chose the Eastern Cape and the Western Cape as these two provinces have previously been compared for their different styles, approaches, as well as resources to the provision of basic education. As you can see on in the table on your screen, there are significant differences in public education and basic education between the provinces, but they've often been compared as two systems that sit on opposite ends of the spectrum. Our concern was not to create a direct comparison between these two education departments. Instead, we are more concerned about the processes that led to the reopening of schools in these provinces that have an unevenness in the ability to provide basic education. Our findings were threefold. The first finding was institutional coordination. The second finding was new capacities. And the third finding was the significant role of teachers and principals, which I'll go through. So the first finding, institutional coordination, is our overriding finding. What we found in both provincial education departments is that regardless of resources or lack of resources, the different capacities, the different ways in which these departments were organized, both of them managed to create intergovernmental and interdepartmental structures to oversee the reopening of schools in both provinces. Now, some of these structures predated the pandemic and probably give reason as to why maybe one department functioned better than the other. However, in the case of the national lockdown and the reopening of schools, both departments created structures or harnessed the energies of existing structures to oversee processes related to procurement, related to resuming the National School Nutrition Program, relating to the procurement of PPE within schools, and monitoring of the delivery of water tanks. We believe that this finding, is important and is integral for the reopening of schools because these departments will ultimately use whatever is available within their capacity, within their resources, within their geographical space to oversee the reopening of schools. Much as the Department of Basic Education will provide policies, guidelines, and maybe some financial resources and support, it is actually schools and provincial education departments that will implement the reopening. So as we move forward in 2021 and as we watch the reopening of schools next week and in weeks to come, we should be asking about what structures exist within departments to ensure that there is a successful and a better reopening of schools than the staggered reopening that we saw last year. The second finding, and this is a finding that will become more and more important and arises out of institutional coordination, is the fact that both provincial education departments actually displayed new capacities in reopening schools and as a way to deal with the changing nature of the pandemic. Now, this speaks to two issues which are important. Firstly, we know that education departments have been criticized for their lack of capacity, for their lack of abilities to oversee the running of education. But in this case, both departments showed that they were able to actually reopen schools without much resourcing from the national level in order to ensure that whatever was required, be it PPE, changing the timetable, school curriculum, was in place for the reopening of schools. In addition, the fact that each provincial education department had only this task to focus on led them to create a new capacity in terms of making sure that their sole focus was to ensure that schools reopen, they reopen safely in line with health and safety protocols, and that they manage the school day accordingly. So we are wondering whether this means that more devolved powers and schools and the ability to concentrate on just a few tasks will not only be key for reopening schools in 2021, but also going forward. As we know, the education system is burdened with a lot of responsibilities on a daily basis, given the routine of schooling and education. However, if we can make sure that departments focus and concentrate on certain things and getting those right and harness these new capacities, then we will find that not only the reopening during the pandemic, but running education as the pandemic subsides will be successful. Finally, the role of teachers and principals. Contrary to public opinion and some beliefs out in our country and globally, teachers and principals were integral to the reopening of schools. They not only managed to reopen schools, they not only managed to trim curriculums and change the timetable of the school day, but they were also managing the pandemic within schools and also within communities. They had to determine whether local transmissions of COVID-19 in their communities warranted a reopening or a closure of schools, what we call devolved school closures in the working paper. This raises a long-standing issue within the education system, specifically issues around teacher post-provisioning. Given the fact that many teachers have comorbidities, and given the fact that a lot of teachers have sadly passed away from COVID-19, there needs to be a serious rethinking about post-provisioning, how we ensure that graduates who've studied teaching are put in the right places within the education system, and that we continue to make sure that teachers are supported, that principals are supported, that decision making is devolved enough for them to reopen schools successfully. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Togo, for that very brief summary of the findings. For our attendees, the working paper is currently on our website. We're in luck, each of our colleagues were able to engage it. And now we'll hear from Dr. Faranaaz Veriava from Section 27 as to what do we make of this opportunity with all the disjointedness in terms of coordination, yet with possibilities. Over to you, Dr. Veriava.
Thank you very much, Norma, and thank you for inviting me to participate in the presentation of your research and giving me the opportunity to engage with the research. We always very glad when we have new ideas and new research that can inform our own work as a Section 27. So whether or not schools should remain closed and under what conditions they should reopen has been the source, one of the biggest sources of anxiety during this terrible pandemic. But this is, of course, outside the obvious public health challenges, which is to contain the spread of COVID-19 and the tragic loss of life, again, from this awful disease. I think many of us have seen how close this have seen during the second wave and have experienced how close death has come to many of us. So as schools reopen and as there is a discussion here and globally about further mutations and variants and further waves, what we can learn from the intensity and the urgency of last year and what we can do better if there is a third wave. And also how we can, in general, improve the education system is very important. To just tell you a small anecdote of mine from the intensity and urgency last year, we were working on the NSMP case, the National School Nutrition Program case, which I will refer to. and it was very cold. And I sat on my bed under my blankets because we were all working at home from morning till night in Zoom meetings, drafting affidavits. And one day my husband came to me and he said, please, can you leave your laptop outside of the bedroom door? So it is, we all know what an intense experience that was last year. More than anything, we have to make the lessons we learn here and around school reopenings globally and how it can be done safely is especially important because there's a constitutional imperative here that every learner has a right to basic education. So based on the findings that Thokozani mentioned, which is institutional coordination, the development of new capacities, and the indispensable role of teachers during the pandemic, I will try and touch on all three of these, but I'm only going to touch on them within the context of Section 27's experience during the pandemic, because that is, of course, what I feel most qualified to speak to. So on the issue of institutional coordination, the report cites some great examples of institutional coordination that I agree with. Working with DOH to monitor infection rates in school communities, ensuring social distancing and the provision of scholar transport, and the rolling out of water tanks to Rand Water. I agree with all of these. But what I want to invite Perry to also think about studying is the kind of institutional coordination, or maybe the lack of it, that went on outside of the National School Nutrition Program and the case around the National School Nutrition Program. I know you have referred to it quite a bit, the actual program. But in terms of the litigation, so Section 27 and equal education represented equal education in two governing bodies of schools in the Limpopo province. And what we got at the end of the case, we won the case and we got a structural order. And that structural order said the department and the 9 provincial education departments have to report regularly to the court and exchange and provide us with the reports on what they are doing to ensure the rollout of the National School Nutrition Program to all qualifying learners. And some of what we saw there has been fascinating. And again, I invite you to study some more. So because the study is based on the Western Cape and the Eastern Cape, the first thing I want to say around the Western Cape is that we did not ask for any relief from the Western Cape. And that was because from the outset, the Western Cape was one of the only province that had initially been rolling out the school nutrition program during the lockdown. We then won the case, and the department was then required to roll out the department and the provincial departments to all the provinces. At the beginning, because there was a phased-in approach to integrating learners back into school, the uptake across the provinces was very poor. But obviously, we knew from our affidavits and our experiences and all the data that learners were really going very hungry. And when the equalizers went out and did their research, and when we went back to our client schools in Limpopo, there was some information that was coming back to us about why they weren't being able to access the food. The one is that parents still had a lot of anxieties about sending their children to school for daily meals. The other was learners that were at home couldn't get access scholar transport. And the third was there was just no news going out about where the food was being provided. So Section 27 and our partners, we decided to feed this information back that we were getting through the reports and that we were verifying against what we were seeing from the department. And we tried to feed the information from the ground back into the department. And that was to say what I've just said to you about all the problems. And we made some recommendations. And this was, well, don't give daily meals, maybe give food parcels. Weekly or even monthly food parcels. Think about your communication strategy to tell learners through WhatsApp groups, through community radio, that the food program is up and running again. Provide scholar transport. And then the other thing we kept on asking for is that the DBE, as the policy-making body, should be filtering down norms for the rollout of this NSNP, providing guidelines, providing directives, on things like communication, on things like food parcels instead of daily meals that were going to a waste, and all sorts of things. And that never just happened to our satisfaction. And I'll give you an example of that. When we saw there was a second wave coming last year, we asked for the DG in our back and forth communication to give us an undertaking that if schools close again, and we know there's been almost a 3-month delay now before learners go back, that they will still roll out the NSMP. And that is because we know more people are hungry during the lockdown than before the lockdown, or during the pandemic than before the pandemic. We got an undertaking from the DG that this would happen. And we were very surprised then when we saw the Eastern Cape MEC for Education tweeting that there won't be a rollout of the NSMP until schools open mid-Feb. So for us, the court order provided, and a structural order, and even in international law around structural orders, it often provides the potential, or in an ideal world, it provides the potential for showing the institutional failures, and for developing solution-orientated, or having a dialogue for better solutions. And this just never happened sufficiently around the NSMP. We thought there could have been a better dialogue between us as civil society and the departments, but also between the departments themselves if the directives were happening properly. So that is just one area where I thought, there could have been, we need to think more about institutional coordination. Around the development of new capacities, yes, there's been a lot of energy and innovation. But what we've also seen, and what we keep on hearing, is that nothing like the pandemic has ever exposed the fault lines and inequalities as we have seen around the pandemic. And this is so true in education. So around sanitation infrastructure, the report rightfully talks about the rollout of the water tanks. And there's also been the rollout of the pit toilets. The report also says, but these are temporary. And, when the lockdown happened and before the rollout was happening, we started receiving complaints from many schools saying, we haven't received water tanks, we haven't received PPE, we haven't received mobile toilets, we just have pit toilets. And this meant that for many under-resourced schools, they couldn't open until they received this, while other better resourced schools went ahead and opened. So what I want to say on this is that we need to maintain this urgency around school infrastructure and fix our sanitation with more permanent solutions. And we have the norms and standards for school infrastructure, and we need to look at implementing it. The government hasn't been great about implementing it up to now. But if there's if there's a new pandemic, as some people say there will be, if there are new challenges, or even just because learners in under-resourced schools should be there in conditions that are not dangerous to their health and that are dignified, then we should do it for that reason alone. There's also a mention of online learning. We know that at least 75% of learners struggled with access because they didn't have either data or actual access to computers and so forth. And there's talk about strengthening ICT and all of that in the report. The other thing that came out from one of the earlier national school readiness surveys done by teacher unions was the lack of actual textbooks and other learning materials. And this happened throughout the pandemic. So at the beginning, yes, things shut down very quickly and people weren't prepared. But even as things went on, there could have been thought to getting workbooks and textbooks out, and this never happened. So I think we need to revisit the obligation around textbooks and making sure that in the absence of an ideal world where you have these huge inequalities, we need to make sure that learners and teachers are still being able to have books at home, and so that learning can continue to take place. Then finally, on new capacities, there's some talk around more autonomy in localized structures in SGBs. I just want to, while I agree with that in some instances, I think there needs to be some caution around go about doing that. And that's because there's such an unevenness in these localized structures. So we need to think about capacity building in these structures. We need to think about checks and balances and accountability. And also, if you followed a lot of the school governance jurisprudence, where particularly historically advantaged schools have had more autonomy over the years, they've sometimes used that autonomy to block out students of other classes, of other races. So we need to be very careful, and we need to look at do more research on this, balancing the kind of autonomy that can happen on a localized level against these kinds of checks and balances. And then my final point is around the indispensable role of teachers, and I think the SG will speak to that. But just to say that I wholly and completely agree, and we need to look at what they are saying about their well-being and also about the broader issues in education around readiness. So I mentioned the National Schools Readiness Survey, and maybe others will talk to it, but this was a collaborative study done amongst the unions, and I think there were 7,000 school principals surveyed. And to just say 54% spoke about their anxiety during the pandemic and the need for psychosocial support. And then there's also a high percentage of people saying they don't know if they're going to take the vaccine. So I think when we talk about vaccine literacy, that is something we also need to be targeting in our teacher communities. And then on the broader issue of school readiness, there's 47% of schools saying that they're not sure that their schools are ready to open. That's a big amount. Then the other issue that's coming up a lot is the dropout rates that are happening as a result of last year. We need to take this information coming from schools. If we're looking at localized structures, do we have localized structures that can go out and make sure that they know which learners are dropping out, trying and find ways of coming back into schools? So we need to look at things like this Teacher Union National School Readiness Survey to look at what the issues are and try and find these solutions to many of the things we are seeing during the pandemic and that we will continue to see post-pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Veriava from Section 27. I think quite a lot has been shared there, and I just want to highlight perhaps something we can return to later on in thinking through around what are the new priorities that we could think through as education stakeholders in terms of the work that lies ahead. And here we have Faranaaz, who says urgency, that we need to be mindful of the urgency, and that in as much as these are also old problems, the issue of the infrastructure backlog is something that we need to also continue to push through. And of course, the challenge with learning materials, more specifically the textbooks. And we know the challenge with the hybrid learning with regard to the textbooks and online teaching. And again, one of the things that were shared that I think are quite key is the idea of access. So whether you are trying to access the material or whether you're trying to access the meals in themselves, there's also the responsibility of scholar transport that's implicated. And we know, again, in terms of the intergovernmental coordination on the National School Nutrition Program and the scholar transport, that we have quite different systems. For example, with the scholar transport, we know some of the provinces, they're administered via the provincial education departments, while others are supported by the Department of Transport. And again, challenges there that speak to institutional coordination. And rightfully so, Dr. Veriava, you are pointing to the institutional failures. And the last thought that I would like to appreciate is this idea of being mindful of celebrating localized autonomy, but also thinking through how would we factor in accountability within these new emerging capacities, if you like. And now I'd like to invite Ms. Xolisa Guzula from UCT. Sis Xoli.
Thank you very much, Noma. I hope everybody can hear me. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for such a detailed paper on what contributed to the successful reopening of schools in 2020. I particularly appreciate the context, the contextual background that you brought forward, so that we can understand why is it so difficult in certain contexts to do certain things, and that perhaps we need to think about whether one solution is suitable for everybody, especially with such varying contexts that our schools operate under. So in reading the working paper, I was particularly concerned with more so for the role of schools and teachers, because what came to my mind was, how was this institutional coordination received? And I think the report would have been more balanced for me if it reported on how this institutional coordination received, and what worked, in which contexts, and what needs to improve. I think those things would have really, really helped. And for example, also the view from a wide range of institutions, not only the provincial governments, or sorry, the provincial education departments. I think Dr. Veriava has alluded to some of those other institutions that were also very much instrumental in shaping how the departments started to implement things, or started to plan and implement solutions to the COVID-19 situation. For example, in your report, you've mentioned the role of equal education for example, that courts, that taking department to court so that it could provide food, nutrition for the children in schools. That was very, very instrumental, and it would have been wonderful to flag it more strongly as another institution that played a very important role, so that it's not just coming from the department. The role of civil society in ensuring that things were happening as well, and also in responding to things that were being implemented, on how they were implemented. For example, we have, in addition to equal education, there was COVID-19 education and schooling group, which organized a variety of NGOs which were concerned about the opening of schools, or even learning when some children couldn't attend schools, what was to be done with those children who had to stay home and not go to school. So that the concern is not just a linear concern with schools opening, but what to do with those children who couldn't attend schools. And of course, the Mualit Language and Literacy Collective, which I'm a member of, was the first to write about online learning, and saying, well, we have an unequal system here, where children, we know from vast communities, do not have tools to allow them to learn via online. And if they do, for example, issues of language would have to be considered. So these children being used in the classroom to teachers who mediate learning for them in their pedagogy, who allow or who explain things in the languages they understand, would suddenly face difficulties when they have to be confronted with materials that appear in English only, for example, online. So those thought processes and ideas and opinions from civil society, I think that those were very important as well in shaping how the department was to implement its solutions to the problems that we are facing. But I do want to say that we appreciate the department and everyone in the department who had sleepless nights trying to find solutions to these problems, especially to the COVID-19 situation, which wasn't stable, and it was forever changing, and things needed to change. I would like to say everybody in education has been a frontline worker in that regard, and that we really appreciate their efforts. But I just got saddened by the fact that it took the pandemic to highlight and bring to the surface the issues of infrastructure that were not there in many of our schools. And again, for years, we know that equal education has been at the forefront of agitating for minimum norms and standards for all schools, and our governments and departments of education hadn't been able to provide those until up until COVID-19. So it's been, I would say, therefore, the learners were living in a pandemic before the pandemic, because if we think about health issues with and children without having water and ablution facilities, this is really something that we really need to take seriously. So the other thing that we need to really another voice perhaps, because I think that we need a wide range of institutions, or not just institutions, but of the stakeholders in getting the department to implement things, with schools themselves. And we have a wide range of schooling, from well-resourced schools to schools in poor socioeconomic backgrounds. But some schools in those contexts managed to take initiative and to implement things even before the departments could do anything. For example, there's a school in the Eastern Cape that people were laying their eyes on, like Nyanga High School, that was making things happen even before the department could deliver things. They were doing things. And I think that the report could have been strengthened by learning from such institutions as to what worked, what didn't work in the rural communities, as well as in well-resourced schools in urban areas. I mention this because the schools in the well-resourced urban areas managed to open even in July, when the president had put on hold on schooling, so that we could begin in August. They applied to the Western Cape, for example, Western Cape Education Department, to continue with teaching and learning, even though the directive from the president was that schools must close. So those schools continued. So how did they manage to continue? What efforts did they put in place to ensure that there was safe opening of schools? So this is very, very important, to learn from the schools themselves, so that we build from the ground up and schools learn from each other, rather than just only hearing from top down, from the department. And I think SGBs, the role of SGBs, like it has been discussed just before me by Faranaaz, it is important, as well as it's important to maintain accountability. But I think, like you say in the report, the SGBs were not highly included in the decision making around solutions on COVID-19 in schooling. And when in those schools, when the SGBs stood their ground and really tried to communicate the challenges that their communities are facing and the schools in their communities are facing, there was some coercion from the department that really made it uneasy for principals to speak out and for SGBs to speak out, because for fear of being singled out. For example, we have a case of Mr. Newman from Heathfield High School in Cape Town, who has been singled out and also has been taken to disciplinary hearing for protecting the children in his community and the community itself, when they were speaking out about the fact that they didn't have the required PPE, they didn't have safe classrooms that would ensure that the children are learning safely. And I think that from your report, you do say that parents at some point in June and principals and unions proposed that schools shouldn't open in winter, rather they should open a little bit later, because they were concerned about the safety of the children. And I don't see how, for example, the case of Mr. Newman, who was also protecting his community and the school, was different from those of other schools and communities. So we are having now a situation where in those schools that opened, parents are starting to distrust the schools as to whether they will protect their children. So they came to fetch their children from school. And also in those schools where these principals are being singled out, they are having distrust of their superiors in the department, because if should they speak out, they will be penalized. So those are some of the issues that we really need to learn from as we go forward. But I must say, I'm feeling uneasy as a parent right now. My child is learning and is attending a public school, right? He is attending a public school. And we know schools are opening on the 15th of February. But some schools have continued with learning, with teaching and learning, even before the opening of the 15th of February. This again speaks to this uneven unevenness in our education system. As a result, those schools who continue with online learning, the children are attending from 8 till 2:30. So you can imagine they're having a full-on day every day before the 15th. And the rest of the children of the country haven't attended school. And so they watch their friends telling them, or they hear from their friends that they've been learning while they have not been learning. So this is a serious issue that we need to consider, because I think, should we have continued with radio and television programs, a lot of children wouldn't be in this situation right now. So while others are learning via online, others could have continued to learn via radio and television. So for me, it shouldn't have had been an either or online or distance education versus face-to-face education. These things could have happened together, because as we also learned from the report, some children only attended a few days of school. So sometimes they attended 2 days and they didn't attend 3 days of the week. Others attended 3 days, others attended for 1 day. From what we have seen in the Western Cape, in the big schools, they attended 1 day a week out of the 5 days. So what happens to the 4 days when they are not in school? While we look at what happens at children who attend well-resourced schools, we know that they have online learning. If they attended on Monday and Tuesday, from Wednesday to Friday, they have online schooling. Shouldn't this therefore have happened for poor schools, where the children could learn through television and radio from the days that they didn't attend school? So I think we need to pay attention to not only wanting to have policies or one solution for everybody, but we should work with a hybrid of teaching methods so that we expose children to learning even when they are not in school. I'm also speaking as a person who coordinated for the COVID-19 education and schooling group the writing of the parent or caregiver guide for caregivers to support their children with learning at home when they were not at school. We struggled to get funding for that guide to be printed so that it can be given to families so that they can support. And it's done in 11 languages. So if the guide had been printed, we shouldn't have had an issue of either schooling or home. It should have been both, because we know there wasn't going to be a 5-day schooling for all children. So for those days that they are not attending school, if they are not listening on television or TV, the guide for parents would have helped the parents to know what to do with their children, even in this January and February, while children are still at home. So I think we need to take a long view of what could happen and look at various approaches rather than to sideline some of the approaches, because we still don't know if schools are going to close. They might close when we have a third wave. So what then? What do we do with parents in that situation? I will end there for now and see and listen to the others. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Xolisa, and thank you for highlighting the role of civil society and other institutions that are concerned with education and how education would continue in the midst of the lockdowns as well as reopenings. I think that is very important. you speak about inequality in online learning, and in the report we did highlight that the DBE as well as Western Cape Education Department and other departments put resources not only online, but they said that they did have radio lessons and television lessons as well. I think our concern is whether there was actually take up. We need to know how many learners actually sat down in front of televisions or listened to the radio, because that will impact their learning in 2021. But also, how long did these lessons go on for? Which provinces, which channels? So I think you're right. There needs to be a hybrid as the pandemic continues, but we also need to monitor these statistics. You also highlighted how, institutional coordination was received throughout the system, and it's important to have that both the top view and the bottom up view. Maybe our SG or the SG of SATU, sorry, can speak to that issue. SG, if you'd like to respond to our paper and some of the issues raised thus far. Thank you.
But good afternoon to everyone, and thanks to the paper as well as the two colleagues who have already put some views around the paper. I think without much waste of time, I will then say, in summary, I agree with the paper, the working paper, in terms of the issues that have been raised. I'm trying to set the time because I talk too much, so sorry about that. So, right. So the issue for me is that I would quickly respond to a few things that have been raised. One, in terms of the institutional coordination, I fully agree with the paper in terms of the operation in silos of intergovernmental structures as well. So there is no a well-oiled system between departments in the manner in which they are working, but also secondly is that there is no maybe there's no blueprint in terms of how, when the government introduced the so-called planning and monitoring department as a fully fledged department, how it was going to be, synergizing everything, so that then there is always coherent and there's always clarity in terms of policy and how these particular departments are working together. So the finding in the working paper in terms of the institutional coordination is very fundamental for me in terms of, do we see collaboration between departments themselves? Okay, or do we still see contestation between departments in terms of competition, including, of course, we have said we're now concentrating on the Eastern Cape and Western Cape. However, I take a broad view of the whole country in terms of what I see is happening and what I saw happening last year. It is that there is an element of competition more than an element of cooperation and coordination and collaboration amongst and within the provinces themselves. So MEC, head of department, they are mostly focused on statistics. Which one is going to be number one next year? So even when we were reopening the schools, the issue was not more about the health and safety of the learners and the teachers and the education support personnel there. It was still more characterized by the push to say, am I going to be number 3 or number 1 between Gauteng and Western Cape, or Gauteng and the Eastern and the Free State? And that in itself for me is that particular coordination is weakened when you do not have a departmental education system that is well coordinated, first and foremost, and it does not encourage these silos in education. So unfortunately, we are in a federal kind of a system, but we are in a national system. That's the problem. So it also obviously touches more on the issues of inter or non-governmental institution in terms of civil society. Critical. It is that the Department of Education in all provinces, I'm so sorry to say it, they don't have a patience for civil society to participate in education. And it's historical because when the apartheid government, in particular in the African schools and black schools, was instituting committees that were running education without any democratic participation by the communities themselves, that in itself has now anchored itself where people have now moved out of the education arena, and therefore the bureaucracy, the political leadership of the country is still in that particular mode of saying you are interfering in our space. We take decision and you have got to hear from us. So there is no tolerance, there is no space to ensure that the civil society in our country is heard, and therefore it is encouraged to even develop more policies in order to assist the department, so that during the period where we were reopening the schools, clearly it is that you needed that voice. The voice of the civil society must be heard. Even the unions themselves, as being part of the inter or non-governmental or civil society or trade unions that are defined in terms of the law to be consulted, it was very difficult to put the department down and say, can we be consulted, and so forth. So you saw a situation where there was like a contestation. Minister pronounces on something, then unions comes and say, and they become like, okay, we're opposing the minister, we don't agree with the minister. That was unnecessary in a pandemic. In a pandemic, you need to encourage the voices of the people and work together, and rather coordinate them better than to want to sideline them. Because then when we were different with the department on whether reopening today or on the 8th or on the 1st, to many people in the country, started sending a sign that says these are the people that are supposed to be teaching our children, and they're saying, no, we're not reopening. What was the message? The message was that we don't have confidence in the public education system because the teachers who are supposed to teach are saying they cannot be teaching because they're not safe. And it was precisely because of this lack of tolerance, lack of encouragement of the civil society, lack of consultation, and the appreciation of consultation in the real sense of consultation, and not these top-down kind of situation that we saw. So come 2021, we also begin to start seeing it, that will go out and then you start seeing unions speaking differently, the department speaking differently. It is still, again, the issue of power to say who takes the decision. And you have already indicated in the structure of the paper that, okay, the MECs and everybody takes the decision, but how do you take a decision that affects millions of learners and thousands of teachers without really consulting properly with the parents who are responsible for the education of their own children? How do you do that with the parents who are in schools? Because we are local parentage and we have a responsibility to care for these children. So how do you take a decision that does not really augur well with them? And every time this contestation are brought to the fore, it's like other people do not want to work where they want to work. So I believe that in 2021, we shouldn't be having any fight whatsoever. We should be agreeing this is what must happen in terms of how we are going to be coordinating. The second area that we have highlighted, which is a very, very critical one, is the development of new capacities. The question you are asking is very fundamental. Will they help us in terms of improving the outcomes moving forward? Will they help us to be able to do better in 2021 and 2022 when we are still living with pandemic or any other pandemic in the future? It's very fundamental. You need to go back to the history as well for you to be able to answer that particular question. It is that you have been able to capture well in the paper from the Eastern Cape that there are factions, and those particular factions really weaken the stability of the bureaucracy to do its work, and hence there was no delivery of PPE on time and all those particular things. So it's a critical question of saying, my view would be that we are supposed to be building on what we have learned last year. What we have learned last year was that the school management teams were very innovative. they were very creative and they were able to do the curriculum trimming themselves. They were able to do the timetabling themselves, and they were then able to then start instilling some hope to the parents who were taking their children out. There was a lot of communication with the parents, a lot of communication with the students to come back to the school when in actual fact it was very difficult to bring them back. So thanks to them, and that is your third area where you said the efforts of the educators sometimes are not being acknowledged that they're doing their best around this particular issue. So critical for me was that the teachers and the school management team were able to help to build resilience of the schools and of the system, which is very critical. Why? Because they were providing that psychosocial service to the learners and those who are working in the schools on a daily basis. So they were building these particular wealth of experience that we need to tap in 2021 to ensure that as and when there is an epicenter or is a hotspot, the school is to be closed. How do we then continue to be able to work on the effort? And I want to propose a few things basically in response to the beautiful presentation that have been made around issues of inequality. One is the issue of the online and blended learning. Online need to be expanded so that we understand that it involves a lot of other things. It's distance learning, it's e-learning, and many other platforms that are there. So one is that you need to begin with that policy that is there, but make the teachers to be the owners of this particular thing. So train them, let them begin to themselves craft their own small work to do, their policies within the school themselves, so that you give them that professional space of autonomy to do that, so that they're then able to translate which learners in terms of the areas and the uniqueness of the areas will rely on distant learning. And distance learning might be through the form of interactive radio lessons, and who may monitor that and making sure that there is an impact study to say how it has impacted in learning when a particular school has been closed at a particular point in time. Not all schools. Even when all schools have closed, you need to do that monitoring and evaluation from time to time. How do learners impact? Now, of course, the Department of Education took celebrities to go and do reading there. It was something else. I'm talking about interactive radio lessons in areas that are rural, where you don't have data, where you don't have the gadgets that you can use, that the radio can play a very important role. I mean, if you look at the Latin America, they rely solely on interactive radio to ensure that the teachers are able to bring lessons to the learners who are disposed from the school because of the pandemic. That's one area. Two, it is that we need an education stimuli in education. What we saw last year when the pandemic was beginning, that the Department of Education takes 2.1 billion back to Treasury. That is unheard of, because education throughout the world is given an education funding because of the social distance that you must have. Two, they need a lot of PPEs in the schools, because you cannot expect the pure schools to be able to fundraise and raise money from the parents who have lost their jobs and be able to avoid that. So you need that particular thing. The calling is, we need more money for education. If you take, for example, Hong Kong, every time there is 5 cases, when they say we lock down, they give money to the education system to ensure that the education does not stop. So in our country, we need to ensure that learning must not stop when we close the school. It must continue, but we need that particular broadband, we need the data and so forth, but we need more training around that. And the issues of inequality is something that we need to address, because the historical issue. You cannot have a situation where other learners learn for 5 weeks and the others learn for 8 months. I mean, how on earth are you going to have this particular generation of children who have got this huge deficit in terms of knowledge, attitude, and skills, because they have not been given the necessary time to do that? And this is where we need to be able to bridge the gap and making sure that we have one national policy that is learning and leveraging the experience and expertise of the schools, rather than one taking decision on the basis of politics. and not on the basis of education soundness of a decision. And that's what our department is doing. They take decisions on the basis of politics, no science, and so forth. And hence, they would not like your Section 27, your equal education. They won't. Why would they like people who want to see the norms and standards being implemented? They won't like that. So that is an issue that we need to look at. So the issue of the placement and training of the teachers, I believe that the system must change. We need to have our higher education institution strengthening the recruitment of the teachers by really making sure that as and when you register as a teacher there, you are a real candidate for that. You've got to go through rigorous admission policy and process so that we are then able to produce the professionals that we need in this particular. It must not guarantee that when you have registered as a teacher, you will then be able to graduate as a teacher. It must be that you have really satisfied, rigorous training, rigorous monitoring, and so forth that is based on school experience for you to be able to be a good teacher at the end of the day, because teaching is about caring. So that's what we need. So we need to change what we call equitable funding formula. It doesn't work. Compare Eastern Cape and the Western Cape. The resources are not the same, but we are supposed to have the so-called equitable formula that is looking at the poverty level of the Eastern Cape, but it doesn't do that. It does not recognize the fact that the apartheid government never built a single school in a rural area, and you still have got those particular schools, no sanitation, no water, and so forth. And it's about dignity, and these are the things that needs to be addressed. So we need to change how we fund our schools so that we deal with it. The last area is the assistant teaching. Globally, it is not a problem to have assistant teaching because it is a structured area where they know exactly what to do. It's not running away from employing qualified teachers to do the teaching, but is to assist the teacher to offload the administrative role of the teacher so that the teacher can concentrate more on what they have got to be doing. So it is not a bad idea. We need to then be able to maybe conceptualize it better. But obviously it's temporary. We're told it's 3 months or 4 months. We don't know if the president tonight will then be saying he's extending the assistant teaching to the school, because it is a resource that you need, which you need permanently and not on a temporary basis, because it addresses the issue of social capital, where parents are working in Johannesburg, their children are in Ulundi, their children are in Jane First. So you need them to help the children to be able to do their homework. I think my 15 minutes is done, and I want to thank you for this opportunity. I agree with everything in the paper, and I agree with the further research. And I would want to encourage some students to also look at the other 3 questions and see if they can do the research. We will be willing to help many of our students because it can help us moving forward. Thank you so much.
That is the SG of SATU, agreeing to disagree with us on certain parts, but certainly encouraging us to think through what we mean by this concept of institutional coordination. I just want to start from the end in appreciating some of the points that you've made, SG, and just starting with the idea of strengthening the recruitment of qualified teachers. I think you're being generous in saying, you know, the teacher assistants have a role to play in support. I think the broader question we should be troubled with is, I know my colleague Togo does not like me phrasing this question in this manner, but do we have enough teachers? And I ask that question to say, do we know the number of graduates? Do we know the number of qualified teachers? And also, how do we think about placing them? Of course, there's someone that knows within the system. Of course, these things are tracked, whether you're talking about Funza Lushaga bursaries and so forth. But I think what we're trying to push through in the dialogue here and thinking about other areas to prioritize is this idea of conceptualizing it better. Because yes, the teacher assistants are only a plug-in for 3 months, but then what becomes, you know, the teacher's role if we're saying we have high comorbidities, and we also have a lot of teachers that are retiring, and we also have a lot of teachers that we've also lost. If you look at the January 2021 parliamentary submission by DBE and looking at the number of infections and tallying them with the number of deaths and the number of teachers and non-teaching staff we've lost, including educators, these are the questions we should be troubled with. How do we conceptualize beyond the stop and go, temporary reopening and closure, the whole notion of teacher placements, and I do agree that are qualified. What's coming out very clearly, right from Dr. Veriava to Usistoli from UCT and also the SG, is this idea of democratic participation. Of course, in the working paper, our interest was in the provincial education department, but I think it is a necessary conversation to say, what do we make of what Usistoli terms as the community practices? And also Dr. Veriava alluded to this in terms of looking more specifically at the equal education case. And I think there's something to be said. And I also see in the comments, there's someone who asked around the parents and so forth. And luckily, the guideline has been shared in terms of thinking through how to incorporate parents and also the burden on parents in terms of teaching and online teaching at home. I do hear the critique in terms of the top-down analysis, both in the working paper, but also in the manner in which decision-making is done. And I think, you know, SG, you sit in a particular position in terms of being able to analyze this and say there's a contestation of power with regards to the decision-making between, you know, the driving forces in the education system with regards to the pandemic, and also the idea of including not just, you know, the SGBs, the SMTs, but including civil society more broadly. And I think it's important that civil society wakes up, for lack of a better phrase. The unions have just issued in January their own findings, and there's a lot of advocacy that's happening in other areas, but also what becomes of civil society demands at this particular point in time, because the inequality exists and it will continue to exist. I think, again, the SG touching on the issue of the funding, the education budget has been shrinking over the years, and this is not just only in South Africa. And again, the idea of the injustice in those who are left behind. And these are the confrontations, colleagues, comrades, and allies that we need to think through. As the SONA comes this evening, as the minister, you know, engaging us on Sunday to say, we know the problems we've inherited in 2020. What do we make of 2021? I'm more concerned with the recovery plans on this idea, because at the end of the day, within the education system, if we're talking about the business of the institute, it's teaching and learning. Colleagues, I would like now to invite Professor Gustafsson, who's going to be our last speaker. We'll just share in for 15 minutes, and then we'll begin with our Q&A. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Norma. And congratulations to you and Thokozani on an excellent, very detailed report, which I can see has a lot of work behind it. I'm lots of interviews, lots of thinking, lots of kind of ordering of very important institutional information and history at this very difficult time. I would like to share some slides. Let me see if I can, if I succeed in sharing a screen. Yes, okay, great, it seemed to work. So I would like to, yeah, I think it's 14 slides. I will respect the time limit. And so, yes, I mean, from what I've read in the report, I think there are three things I would like to pick up on. The one is just learning, sustainable development goals and learning. The other is this whole issue of ICTs, both in the COVID context and more generally. And then finally, just a little bit, some points on planning in this current very uncertain COVID environment. So I'd like to start with the learning angle, because there's not been much kind of focus on this in the webinar so far, although it's implied. I mean, when we're talking about different levels, unequal levels of access to schooling and school closures and so on, what we really mean is unequal access to learning. And I think it's worth just keeping in mind where we are coming from, partly because this is often not very well understood, in my view, and I think that this can sometimes confuse the debates. if you look at this graph, I mean, you can see generally these lines are all moving up. These are the different assessments that, international assessments that South Africa has taken part in over the last 25 years. And we essentially moved from a position that was well below our neighbor Botswana to a position currently where we are more or less on a par with Botswana when it comes to things like reading skills at different grades, numeracy, mathematics. Botswana is not a fantastic kind of benchmark. Botswana performs much lower than Kenya, for instance, but at least we're now up to the level of our neighbor. That's the movement we've been seeing for 25 years. And what we need to be asking ourselves is, where does this pandemic leave us? And yeah, the fact that we're at Botswana's level isn't that great if you consider that, I mean, many of you will have be familiar with these types of statistics. 22% of grade 4 learners not reading for meaning. And this is what informs the presidential commitment to all 10-year-olds reading proficiently by 2030. It's all kind of wound up with the Sustainable Development Goals. These improvements have been actually quite good. And this is a point that I think a lot of South Africans find difficult to accept, because there's a lot that is wrong with our schooling system. And the levels are still very low. The learning levels are much lower than they should be for a country like ours. But the improvements have been about as fast as you could expect from any country. We couldn't really have improved much faster than we did. So the gains are really important, and credit must go to somewhere, to the system, to parents, to teachers, and so on. However, and now I'm getting to the pandemic, just before the pandemic, the 2019 TIMSS results were released, and they showed us something that is quite worrying. They showed us that at the secondary level, in grade 9, performance was continuing to improve. In grade 4, things came to a halt. Improvement came to a halt. This is extremely worrying. This is now in numeracy, but it's likely to be reflected in other subjects as well. This is at the primary level in grade 4. So this is the one kind of problem that we sit with right now. Something appears not to have, the engine seems to, in a way, have stopped at the primary level. And then we were hit by the pandemic. This is from a UNESCO Institute for Statistics blog. And this type of graph demonstrates kind of where learning is likely to go as a result of the pandemic. Now, in this particular instance, we're looking at grade 3 reading. This is for the world, not for South Africa. So if you look at over time, up to this goes up to 2035, worldwide, there has been an improvement, not just in South Africa. Things have been getting better. It's estimated that perhaps up to 10% of children would have kind of fallen below a level of kind of reading proficiency. So there's been an absolute awful shock in 2020. The way we move back to the original expected trajectory could take many different paths, and it depends largely on how well we manage to catch up and remedy the learning losses that have occurred. And what we must forget is remedying this in 2021. These losses are so serious that it will take many years. So there needs to be a multi-year plan to ensure that we get back to where we should be. So that's the learning. Yeah. So we could be currently we're at about 22% of learners reading. We've dropped possibly to around about 18%, and with hard work we can be up at 40% by 2030. Of course, the president has said we must all our children must be reading. However, yeah, I mean it's really it's very difficult to change these indicator values for various reasons. Education is very difficult to change. So even if we reached 40% by 2030, 40% of young children reading at an internationally proficient level, I think we would have moved ahead quite effectively. So this is from a report that I produced with Carol Nugadaliwe from Department of Basic Education, and it's a similar kind of graph, and it shows that depending on how we deal with the catch-up, we could be sitting with below expected levels of performance in grade 12 up to about 2031. Again, emphasizing the huge risks that this pandemic has confronted us with. And how do we remedy these things? Well, if we look at the medium-term strategic framework of government, which is government's kind of highest level 5-year plan, there are some points around, and it should be emphasized, this is a plan that was released just before the pandemic. So it does not deal specifically with the pandemic, but these are things that South Africans will hold government accountable to, in addition to the new priorities that have been created by the pandemic. And you'll see that there are very important steps towards, for example, the new systemic evaluation, trying to get a better grip of reading skills at every primary school. These are things that are in the plan and that will be that are even more important than before, given the kind of shock that we've had, because we're only really going to be able to bring about the right support if we know the levels of reading at different schools. The MTSF also looks at action and support issues, and many different priorities from professional development, reading in indigenous languages, professional communities of learning, kind of more locally driven teacher development, the kind of thing that I think the SG of SATU would support, essentially teachers having a stronger voice in the teacher development area. And then, right, let me just look at the time. Moving to ICTs. Now, Norma and Thokozani, your report, for obvious reasons, deals a lot with ICTs in schools and what opportunities are available to us on the basis of the technologies that we have. And in an international comparison, our ICT presence is not strong in schools. And more seriously, the human capacity around ICTs is not as strong as it should be. And there are a number of surveys, including the recent TALIS survey, which underscore this. In your report, you refer to, I think it's 300,000 teachers who've been trained within a Microsoft kind of training program. I think we need to be a bit careful about some of the figures, and I mean, I think Xolisa was kind of alluding to, be very careful about the sources that one gets one's information from. I think sometimes, if you only look at officials, if you only interview officials, not that you've only interviewed officials, but officials will give you particular information, but even, private sector participants in ICT projects will try to push their numbers quite strongly. The question I'm posing on this slide is, yes, we have activities that are on the agenda. Should we not be paying more attention to a national strategy? We still don't have a national strategy for ICT in schools. Norma and Thokozani, you clearly had a look at this report beyond the numbers, which is an important report. And one of the points that this report makes is that we still need a strategy, and we need a strategy for a number of reasons. We need a clearer picture of where we are. All right, I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to go into this in detail. But so here you have some details on things like computer labs in schools, teacher use of the internet, which is not high, teacher use of the internet for kind of professional purposes and teaching and learning. Secondly, we need a strategy. What we need in a strategy is not just what are the technology things we are taking forward, but what exactly is it about ICTs that will enhance learning? And is it, for instance, individualized learning? Is that perhaps the magic ingredient that ICTs is going to add to learning? Because although access to the ICTs is in itself an extremely important educational exercise, how we also want the ICTs to enhance literacy, numeracy, and how exactly does it do that? A strategy needs to tell us that. We need to make important choices regarding technologies and standards, otherwise people won't invest. And then I'm almost finished. Where do we start? I mean, there's so many ideas in this ICT in schools arena, and the pandemic has kind of encouraged enthusiasm for this, and that's a good thing. But where does one start? In this particular report that I produced with some colleagues from Stellenbosch, I mean, one of the things we focused on is something very basic. In grade 12, what is the access to technical subjects in schools? I'm not referring to colleges now, I'm referring to schools. If you compare 2002 to 2018, the number of Black African learners who are taking technology subjects has increased substantially. But the inequalities are still quite large, especially, I mean, if you look at percentages down here, fewer than 10% of Black African grade 12s are accessing technology subjects in matric, against 50% of white learners. So this is a kind of a legacy from apartheid that we are not dealing with well, and it's something that could take us forward in terms of ICTs in schools. It doesn't require a lot of innovative. We don't need new policy for this. This is simply about creating more equity within the existing policies and addressing things like these numbers that you see here, participation in computing subjects in grade 12. And then, yeah, let me not dwell on this, but this is also off the UIS blog. Different, it's very complex right now to prioritize across these different areas. What does one prioritize? For example, school nutrition is going to, in some respects, be a financial lobbying exercise, because what we haven't really discussed in this webinar is that education budgets, like government budgets in general, are under immense strain because of the revenue losses. So this is going to make it really hard to defend budgets, but we need to. Faranaaz, you referred to communication. Learners, schools often not knowing exactly what policies are. And then this is the last slide. So this is about, this addresses some of the questions that were raised around access to the different technologies. And this graph, which is out of the one of the CRAM reports, looks at levels of access to different technologies across from poorest to least poor. We can see, when it comes to internet, clearly more access among the rich. I doubt that the poor in South Africa, 30% of poor learners accessed the internet for learning purposes during the first lockdown. I highly doubt that, which kind of, yeah, I mean, poses kind of warnings about how one collects data in these types of exercises. In this instance, it was a telephonic survey. But what really stands out, and I think this response is one of Xolisa's questions, is books and television stood out as the most accessible technologies during the first wave. This is what reaches most people, even more than radio. So that is clearly something that one needs to take into account as one moves forward. Thank you very much. I think I'm just 2 minutes over. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Gustafsson, on that. I mean, you said quite a lot, and I'll just comment on two things and we'll quickly go on the Q&A. Togo is on standby to moderate that session. I absolutely agree with you on the national strategy when it comes to the ICT. But like I said at the beginning, I think there are three categories that we need to look into, not just the strategy, not just the infrastructure, but also the skill in itself. But there's also the question that Xolisa raises in terms of, we know that there are hits in these websites. We know that there are scheduled programs, but what we know of the actual learning, and I think you try to allude to that, even though it's a separate topic, the idea of regional assessments. I mean, we're going to have a sense, for example, with the 2020 matrics, the Eastern Cape particularly has been improving with the learner performance, at least for the past 5 years. So it'll be interesting to have a sense in terms of what has come of that. But what I appreciated with what you've just shared is, again, the biased approach we have in our education system that focuses on learner performance and prioritizes grade 12, because we chose that. We chose to prioritize grade 7 and grade 12, even with the teacher innovations, even with the support at the school level, with the WhatsApp groups. We know the focus was on grade 12. So it is not surprising for me that grade 4 numeracy dropped in 2019 and that it is most likely to drop. And then there's the issue of defending the budget. I wanted to say Amanda on that one. But then again, how do we go about it in making sure that we prioritize this? I think another aspect, you recite the issue of sources of information and data with regards to training. One of the things that has happened in ICT development, at least during the pandemic, is the private partnership. We haven't looked into that, never mind accountability. But what is brought in these different initiatives? Yes, there may be caps aligned, but what do we make of the interventions that have come in? If a teacher has been trained for 48 hours, what do we know of that level of intervention? And so you have a lot of these companies, if you like, that work within the ICT sector that have done bare minimum because of a case that we experienced about 5 years ago. And they literally adopted, if I'm not mistaken, less than 6,000 schools and dumped tablets and computers with no ICT infrastructure, with no airtime or anything that speaks to it. So yes, the numbers float on the internet insofar as training NGOs and so forth, but we haven't even begun to actually ask ourselves about these platforms as we move to the ICT. So I just wanted to appreciate that comment. Togo, please lead us through to the Q&A.
Thank you so much, and thank you once again to our panelists. There are 2 questions thus far which I'll throw to our panelists. So one question which came through, and this is for the SG of SATU. You spoke about the psychosocial part of the education system and education staff. Please, can you elaborate on this? Another question which came through, and this actually was a question from Prof. Gustafsson's presentation. The question is, what do we prioritize? As I said in our presentation, the education system has a lot that it's expected to do in order to see through a school day during the pandemic and even before the pandemic. So I'd like each of our panelists to respond to that question. What do you think is the one, maybe 2 things that you think we need to prioritize in this 2021 academic year and going forward? But we'll start with SG explaining to us what he meant about psychosocial skills. And then I think we can go to Faranaaz about what do you think we should prioritize from 2021 onwards.
Thank you, Soko, for the opportunity. I'll be very brief. You say teachers come back in 2021. They have lost their colleagues, most of them. And the learners were hoping to meet this teacher. And they are being told that the teacher is gone or their colleagues, the others are gone. And therefore, psychosocial services from the perspective of the union is that it helps in building the resilience by dealing with the anxiety first and foremost, because we can't keep on living with fear. We've got to make sure that we go into the school knowing very well that if we educate, if we are able to embark on awareness and education, we build that particular resilience in our learners, in our community, so that we can contain the spread of the disease and not live in fear of the disease, but rather say, what do we best to ensure that we're able to do that. That's very critical. Secondly, is the mental health of the teachers. They grieve when one of their family members has passed on, and they are coming to schools on the 15th to meet the learners, and their mental health status is not at the best in terms of them being able to help the children to really adapt to a new situation and so forth. So they need that support of psychological, social services from the therapists, from the psychologists and psychiatrists. And again, it brings back the institutional coordination. Do we have a coordination between the Department of Education, which is as best to be able to say, we don't have therapists in education, we don't have social workers in education, there are not so many. Can we work with the Department of Correctional Services? Is there a way we can do that? Can we work with the social development? And can we work with the Department of Health so that we are able to benefit from these particular scarce skills that we don't have in education in order to address that? But we also have to address the issue of burnout. So when the teachers are on comorbidity, the schools in the poorer provinces don't appoint substitute teachers, then the teachers have got to take more workload, despite the fact that the learners are fewer, but the workload is more because now you've got to do the work that 2 or 3 teachers are not there at the school level because they have received concession, and therefore you need that particular psychosocial. But the other psychosocial social services that really in the paper comes very, very, very handy for this country in particular is to really to institutionalize education. Okay, that the school is not only about 1 + 2 in terms of education, it is also about development. It is also about providing feeding, providing many other things, in terms of life skills and other things and so forth. So if we don't have sports in our schools, if we don't have arts and music in our schools and so forth, which are really the issues that we're supposed to be addressing in order to help us to learn, are the things that we need to do. So psychosocial service is very critical as far as we're concerned, because so many teachers are hospitalized, not because of COVID, but hospitalized because of depression. And it is not now. If you go to the Human Science Research Council, it will tell you that absenteeism in education is high on the basis that there is a lot of pressure on the teachers in terms of administration and many other things. So what are the priorities? Because you said that we must also deal with that. Look, one of the priorities for us is to really immediately question the orthodox of assessment. The pandemic offers us an opportunity to not really reduce our children to be robots by really still emphasizing about this testing and testing and testing. So it offers us an opportunity to go and review and revise the assessment policy statement and the areas that we need to be assessing. Secondly, which for me is a priority, is what I have already indicated. If you don't train the teachers on online or distance or e-learning and so forth, you're not going to be able to have blended learning. So it's a priority. We cannot go back and cry that we want to cry for face-to-face all the time. It's not going to be possible. Even if we take that social development and social interaction away, we can always be able to mitigate that by giving the teachers the necessary skills, knowledge, and give them the gadgets to be able to work. So data must fall. That's it. We need the broadband. Thank you.
Thank you to the SG. Dr. Veriava, if you could tell us what your 1 or 2 priorities are for 2021. What should we prioritize given the pandemic and moving forward, especially in terms of recovery, as we saw in the last presentation?
Yeah, I want to say you are asking me probably one of the most difficult questions that you can ask anybody in education. And I found Professor Gustafsson's presentation on the future of achieving reading levels very, very depressing. What I want to say in education is that what many education specialists have said, and I am not an education specialist, I'm a lawyer, and that is Graham Bloch often talks about the toxic mix in education and the many issues that are dysfunctional in the South African education system, and that other stores say there is no silver bullet, like with ARVs or now with getting the right vaccine. What we need is a multifaceted approach to education, where we prioritize education, look at what the blockages are and fix them. But what just listening, we need to really, and I also don't know that I agree that we haven't done enough that we've done enough and to get people reading, and that getting people to read is slow. I think we could have done a lot more to unblock the kind of many issues that have made us reach the poor levels of literacy and numeracy that we reach at the end of the foundation phase. So I really think we have to look at what the issues are that are holding back foundation phase learning and address that. The other thing is, you would have seen that now in the chat, I said yes, Amandla, to defending the budget. One of the biggest cuts that we saw in the budget now under the special allocations budget during COVID was the amount of money that was taken from the conditional grants for school infrastructure. And, we have seen actual cases where schools that have gone without roofs since 2012 are now not going to be fixed, because they say that some of that money is being reallocated to COVID. Not all of that money is being reallocated to COVID. And, there are a whole lot of complex issues around that. So I do think that defending the budget for education going forward and using that money very carefully is very important.
Thank you for your response. The funding which has been taken from education is going to be a huge problem. We can't predict what effect that will have on learning going forward, except to keep trying to make sure that we get as many resources as possible into education. And I think, Xolisa, you can come in here and tell us, what do you think we should prioritize, given the discussion that we had, which you began regarding civil society, their role, the lack of resources that we're now going to see? What do you think we'll be able to prioritize?
I think, I'll talk like a rural child who grew up in a village with little access to books, that for me, radio was the most important thing for storytelling. We had stories. At the time, of course, we had Ciskei and Transkei, and we had Radio Transkei and Radio Xhosa, and both radio stations were offering stories in isiXhosa. So at night at 8, we would gather around the table and listen to a story that was playing at 8 o'clock. And midday, if it was 1 o'clock, whether it was during holidays or weekends, at 1 o'clock, we knew that there was a repeat of a story, whether it was from Radio Transkei or Radio Ciskei. So we had 2 stories. At night, we'd listen to one radio story. At 1 o'clock, we'd listen to another radio, story. So in that way, we're able to capitalize on storytelling through the radio. And this is probably the reason why when we started Nalibali, National Reading for Enjoyment Initiative, I named it Nalibali, because when we, in the village, we have different houses in the homestead. And so when the clock hit 1 o'clock or it hit 8 o'clock, you would call others in the other houses and say, Nalibali, here's the story. And every one of us would gather around for a story. And that has had an influence in how we turned out to want to read. So I think we should never underestimate that, especially during the COVID times, because it's going to be hard for teachers who teach reading while wearing masks. And we know the teaching of reading needs demonstration of the shape of the mouth, even when you are enunciating different letters and sounds. When you are teaching to the children, it's going to be harder. But we have to support our teachers by encouraging parents to tune in into these programs. We already have, like we talk about civil society, we already have these organizations like Nalibali. We have Shine Literacy Trust, we have Funza Literacy Trust, and there are many others that are working on reading. And I think collaboration with those organizations will ensure that the children have access and support for reading in their homes. For example, Shine Literacy Trust printed the parent or caregiver support guide and gave it to the parents. And we have a beautiful report from them who say the parents said they enjoyed using the guide. And one parent, for example, had a son who's 19 years old who was not back at school, who was enjoying reading through the guide and helping the younger ones in the house as to what literacy activities they can do with these little ones, as well as numeracy activities, because numeracy and literacy needs to, you can integrate them in the family setting. It's very, very important to work with children in those subjects. So I think that we have to emphasize and to support, emphasize reading and numeracy and maths at home, but also in ways that give examples to people that are workable in the family settings, in various settings, as well as train parents in some ways. So if Nalibali already has a huge amount of resources from their website, they would just need support to print them and give them to families. There are also so that can't listen online on those stories. Funza Literacy Trust is very well now anchored in this technology, and we have many high school learners who learn to write by going to Funza Literacy Trust sites and become readers and writers. So they read each other's stories, they write each other's stories, and sometimes when they are very good stories from those, Funza Literacy Trust prints them into small short story books from the learners themselves. And they've been using technology forever. And I think they can be used to help train teachers, because now they have managed, even through COVID, to ensure that we have 2 million learners tuning in every month onto Funza's website. So, and they have tracking devices to see who comes in and when, so a lot has to be done around reading. And I think we must never underestimate storytelling, story reading, story sharing, whatever you want to call it. It is very important for children.
Thank you. I'm going to circle back to Prof. Gustafsson, who actually gave us that shopping list of what it is we need to prioritize. But I'd like to ask you a question around, the methods that we can use to make sure that we catch up in the next few years. I think you mentioned the year 2031, was it? And someone in the chat has asked, how do we support parents who don't actually have knowledge of learning systems or access to the internet? Because this will be essential for catching up. And as Xolisa has just explained, we can have radio lessons, but how do we integrate this into the home? And how would we be able to catch up outside of the classroom setting, especially if the pandemic continues to be unpredictable?
Thank you. Long question. I'll try and give a short answer. I think it is important to always to go back to what is in government's plans. It's good to have ideas, but it's also important to be critical of plans and priorities that exist, and look at how one implements this and holds government and institutions accountable for these what's in these plans. And yeah, so I think some of the problem is not just what do we do, what do we prioritize. The problem, and this is something that PARI specializes in, is why are there so many things, good things in plans that then don't, reach fruition? For example, an ICT strategy in education is something that we've had for almost 20 years. Why is it that there's the cycle, and we don't kind of reach finality on certain things? But okay, let me say something about what do we do? What can we do in the near future? How can parents be empowered in all of this? I think that the MTSF, the government's 5-year plan, has some important points on how to get reading right. There needs to be specific kinds of support to teachers. To be honest, and we know that many teachers are actually not very good at teaching reading, and there are techniques that teachers need to learn about. But one also needs some level of kind of knowledge and accountability. So, in South Africa, within the SADC region, our primary schools, in particular our primary schools, are the least kind of, we know the least of all these SADC countries in terms of national systems that look at issues like reading and numeracy. I know in your report you refer to, for instance, the Western Cape system, which collects data from schools, but a lot of these systems are based on what the marks teachers themselves give. Those play a role, but they are not going to really get to the kind of the core of the problem, which is how many learners are not able to read. And I mean, I take the SG of Satu's point about one needs to avoid an orthodoxy around assessments, and this is a very important conversation which we can't have now, but one needs to somehow find a way of getting a better handle on reading in schools. Gauteng, for instance, is doing relatively easy sample-based kind of testing where the district officials come in, they ask a few learners to read. It's not offensive, it doesn't irritate teachers, it doesn't get in the way of teachers, but it's an important way for district officials to get a sense of, are children reading in the school? And I think that we need to deal with that. And this is one way of empowering parents, because if parents don't know how well reading is taught at the school, it just makes participation of parents quite difficult. And we then sit with this current situation where parent participation in school governing bodies is often about funding, and that's important. Funding of schools is important, but parent participation is not to a large extent about learning, and it's partly because parents lack the information about learning. But I think that the discussion about the orthodoxies of assessment is a fascinating topic that needs more attention. There are neoliberal countries, there are socialist countries, there are communist countries that all do different types of assessment, and one doesn't have to kind of link assessments to particular kinds of governance systems in the country. And I think I'm sure, others here would be aware of the problems we had with ANA. And there's a very good assessment that unions participated in on what the problems were with ANA. And they're mistakes we must not repeat. But we still do need to have, we need to take some action on reading. And just finally, Faranaaz, sorry about the depressing statistics. I don't mean to say that we shouldn't aim, say, to have 100% of children reading by 2030. But at the same time, I think when we set these targets, and let's set ambitious targets, but at the same time, let's see how quickly do countries around the world actually change these things. And it is quite sobering. But who knows? I mean, maybe we can break a world record and move faster than what other countries have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And on that note, I would like to emphasize the Newman case that I think Xolisa brought up. I have reposted the information about the Newman case in the Western Cape. I think that it is important that in the spirit of supporting teachers and educators and principals, as we say in the report, we need to be aware of these cases. I would also like to give a special shout out to two of our attendees who are talking about the SABC. I think we definitely need the SABC to participate in this institutional coordination of learning on television and radio. So thank you for pointing that out, which our attendees have done. I would like to say thank you to all of our panelists. This is a busy time of the year for us because we are watching closely what is happening on the ground with regards to reopening schools. We are hoping that there won't be any further delays, but we're very aware that this is a complex process. It is unprecedented, not only for our generation, generations maybe before us, but definitely this generation that is going through this within schools. So thank you so much for participating. We know that there are many, many things that you would be doing at this time. Thank you to our attendees. Thank you for keeping the chat going. We would also like to say to our PARI colleagues, thank you very, very much for helping us and holding this work for us. Thank you, special thanks to our communications manager, Vishanti, who is not on screen, but she has been making sure that everything runs well, runs perfectly. Vishanti, we thank you very, very much. And all I can say to close out is let's watch the news and see what happens over the next few days, especially as our learners hopefully go back to school. Let's keep our ears and our action on the ground, our boots on the ground, in the sense that we will continue to do this type of research, support teachers, support civil society organizations, support institutions who have the best interests of our learners at heart. And we will see where this takes us. Maybe another webinar is on the horizon so that we can look back and say, we said all these things, where are we now? Thank you very much, everyone. Have a fantastic afternoon. And we really appreciate you attending and participating.